This hearing will come to order. This is on attacking Hezbollah's financial network, different policy options that we have. And so we consider these additional steps needed to confront one of the top terror threats in the world, and that threat is Hezbollah. It is a terrorist group that's based in Lebanon, where it is a significant political force as well. So if you look at the history, it dates back to 1982, when members of Tehran's Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds force first deployed in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. And they created, they armed, and they funded a small force which became Hezbollah. Today, as the leading Iranian proxy, Hezbollah continues to be Iran's front line against Israel. Since its 2006 war with Israel, Hezbollah has dramatically grown its supply of rockets and missiles, allowing it to strike throughout Israel with much greater precision and force. So I was in Haifa in 2006, and at that point in time there were 10,000 of these rockets fired out of an inventory of about 20,000. And I saw the consequences of it. There were 600 victims from Haifa in the trauma hospital who were being treated as a result of the attacks on civilian neighborhoods. It's 11 years since that period of time, and now instead of 10,000 rockets and missiles remaining in the inventory, there are 110,000. And these are of increasing sophistication. And one observer even wrote that Hezbollah is now, in his words, more militarily powerful than most North Atlantic Treaty Organization members. One of the reasons for this, by the way, is that many of these newer missiles they're working on, Iran is working on, developing, and I'm talking about the government, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, working on the ability to make these GPS-guided missiles. Hezbollah is putting its military power to very effective use. In Syria, its fighters are key to the efforts by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and Moscow's efforts to prop up the Assad regime, along with Russian troops and Iran's Revolutionary Guards. For 30 years, Hezbollah has remained Iran's proxy, and Iran remains Hezbollah's primary source of financial support. In April of 2015, its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, boasted that even under sanctions, Iran still funded Hezbollah's terror war. And he anticipated that a rich, in his words, a rich and powerful Iran, which will be open to the world, would be able to do even more. The Iran nuclear agreement has made it possible for Iran to provide Hezbollah with a windfall. As one witness will testify today, Hezbollah's activities since the nuclear agreement have expanded in scope. But Tehran is not Hezbollah's only source of income, because since its inception, Hezbollah has developed a broad criminal network involved in a range of illegal activities, from drug trafficking to cigarette smuggling to money laundering to counterfeiting. And these global terrorists double as global criminals. Indeed, in February 2016, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, in an operation led by one of the witnesses who's here with us today, implicated Hezbollah in a multi-million-dollar drug trafficking and money laundering network that spanned 4 continents and put cocaine, ultimately, on the streets of the United States. The committee is focused on the best way to attack Hezbollah's financial network and its tentacles across the globe. And in 2015, we led the way to enact the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act to target those that facilitate financial transactions for Hezbollah. This has helped put Hezbollah in the worst financial shape in decades, according to a former top Treasury official, despite Iran's continued support. Part 2 of this legislation is coming, but unfortunately that's of little comfort to Israelis staring down at an arsenal of rockets that sit just across the border from Lebanon, or the Syrians being slaughtered at the hands of Hezbollah operatives that are participating in ethnic cleansing in Syria. We look forward to hearing from our witnesses witnesses today on ways in which the United States can further tighten the grip, and I now yield to our ranking member today, Mr. Deutsch, for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and Mr. Engel for holding today's hearing on what is arguably one of the greatest threats to U.S. security interests and the interests of so many of our allies, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today as well. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization that has attempted to carry out or has successfully carried out attacks on multiple continents, from the bombing of the U.S. Marine Barracks in 1983 to the bombing of a Jewish center in Argentina in 1994 to the bus bombings in Bulgaria in 2012. Hezbollah's reign of terror has no geographical boundaries. Perhaps most concerning in recent years has been Hezbollah's entree into Syria. Working on behalf of the murderous Assad regime, there are estimated to be 7,000 Hezbollah fighters inside Syria. Receiving significant military support from Iran, Hezbollah, along with various Iranian-backed militias, have assisted the Assad regime in its devastating attacks on the Syrian people. In turn, ISIS-affiliated retaliatory attacks have been launched inside Lebanon, killing innocent Lebanese civilians. Hezbollah's involvement in Syria has fed the emergence of the Russia-Iran-Assad alliance. Open-source reporting now details the transfer of advanced weaponry from Russia to Hezbollah. It has been reported that Hezbollah is in possession of Russian-designed surface-to-air shoulder-mounted missiles. This is in addition to the precision-guided missiles it is apparently now receiving from Iran that will add to its arsenal of over 120,000 rockets capable of reaching every corner of Israel. And Hezbollah is now sending fighters to Iraq and to Yemen. Let me be clear, there can be no future in Syria where Iran and/or Hezbollah has a permanent military presence. And it remains to be seen how this administration thinks that it can cooperate with Russia in Syria when Russia has so far been unwilling to separate itself from Iranian efforts to strengthen Assad. Last month, Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah stated that the conflict in Syria had entered what he described as a new and critical phase in which Damascus, Moscow, Tehran, and Hezbollah were, and I quote, in more harmony politically and militarily than at any time. Hezbollah has long received hundreds of millions of dollars a year from Iran. However, Hezbollah has expanded its own financing operations to include what has become known as the business affairs component, a transnational criminal network that engages in everything from narco-trafficking to money laundering to the sale of counterfeit cigarettes and goods. These operations have gained significant foothold in Latin America, in Europe, and in Asia, and in Africa, rather. Increased cooperation between U.S. law enforcement and law enforcement entities around the world has resulted in significant exposure and breakup of many of Hezbollah's illicit financing networks. Project Cassandra, a DEA-led effort, which we will hear more about from our witnesses, exposed a massive narco-trafficking ring. International cooperation is crucial to our efforts to disrupt Hezbollah, and this is precisely why our allies in Europe must join the United States, the GCC, Canada, and others in designating the whole of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. The idea that there is separation between Hezbollah's military and political wings is, quite frankly, laughable, which is why I recently introduced a resolution urging the EU to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. I'm proud to be joined by a bipartisan group of members in this effort, including members of this committee, our Chairman Emeritus Ross Leighton, Mr. Liu, Mr. Zeldin, and Mr. Schneider. Congress has played a significant role in preventing funds from flowing to Hezbollah. In 2015, I was proud to join Chairman Royce in introducing and passing the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act. And I just want to note that when we first introduced those new sanctions, we were told, as we so often are warned against the perils of using economic sanctions, that the Lebanese banking sector would collapse. But through the work of this committee and outreach to those Lebanese banks, that has not been the case. In fact, Lebanon's central bank has shut down the accounts of Hezbollah members and affiliates. But there's more that we can do. Secondary sanctions, for one, proved extremely effective in our policy toward Iran. Today provides us with an opportunity to hear from our witnesses new policy prescriptions for cracking down on Hezbollah, both on the military and terrorism fronts, and ways to stop its funding streams. Mr. Chairman, before turning it back over, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a statement by the Anti-Defamation League supporting new legislative efforts to crack down on Hezbollah's funding.
Without objection.
I appreciate that, and I look forward to this committee working together as we regularly do in a bipartisan manner under your leadership, Mr. Chairman, to move forward with these new efforts. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman,
Deutsch.
if I could just add,
Yes.
I have joined in the resolution, so there are other members as well.
And I thank my friend from Virginia. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. And this morning, we're pleased to be joined by a very distinguished panel. We have Dr. Matt Levit, Director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he previously served as a senior official at the Treasury Department. He has written extensively on Hezbollah. We also have Dr. David Asher. He's a member of the board at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he has played a senior role in numerous economic and financial pressure campaigns. He was an early pioneer in tackling North Korea's proliferation network. We also have Mr. Derek Maltz is with us, the Executive Director of Government Relations at PenLink. And previously, Mr. Maltz led the Drug Enforcement Administration's Special Operations Division in actively targeting narcotics trafficking tied to Hezbollah. We have Dr. Mara Carlin, Associate Professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She previously served as an aide to the Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Defense with a focus on the Levant. So without objection, the members' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or extraneous material for the record. And we'll start with Dr. Levit, and we'll ask you to summarize your remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Royce, Mr. Deutsch, members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here to testify before you today and assess our efforts and those pursued to date to counter Hezbollah's ability to exploit the international financial system to its benefit. The regional and international threats posed by Hezbollah have only increased over time, underscoring the importance of denying the group the financing and resources critical to its ability to function. Hezbollah has, in fact, experienced a series of financial setbacks, in part because of the actions we've taken, leading U.S. officials to describe the group as being, quote, in the worst financial shape in decades. Indeed, in recent months, Hezbollah has resorted to launching an online fundraising crowdsourcing campaign entitled Equip a Mujahid campaign, which calls for donations, large and small, payable all at once or in installments, to equip Hezbollah fighters. It's also promoted a fundraising campaign on billboards and posters in Lebanon, promoting a program in which supporters can avoid recruitment into Hezbollah militia forces for a payment of about $1,000. These are desperate measures for a group suffering through tough financial times, and yet it has enough money to do a great many disturbing things around the world. I should stress here that of the various actions we're suggesting, that I'm suggesting and others, the idea is not to undermine the Lebanese economy, but to protect it from exposure to the criminal and money laundering enterprises in which Hezbollah is deeply involved. It should therefore not surprise that after Congress passed the Hezbollah International Finance Prevention Act, Lebanon's central bank issued a circular ordering Lebanese banks to close accounts belonging to individuals and institutions associated with Hezbollah. According to the central bank, hundreds of Hezbollah-linked accounts have since been closed. Now, Hezbollah continues to operate in Europe despite the partial ban in July 2013, and it's aggressively engaged in criminal enterprises in Africa and in South America. And despite being designated as a terrorist group by the Gulf Cooperation Council, Hezbollah reportedly began storing some of its funds outside Lebanon in response to the effect of the HIFPA legislation, including in places like Iraq and Dubai. Now, Hezbollah continues to get significant support from Iran, but I think today I want to focus on its global criminal enterprises. And I'm going to leave the business affairs component and other things to my colleagues. What I want to highlight here are some of our successes. For example, the extent of Hezbollah's drug connection was underscored in the wake of the U.S. Treasury's narcotics kingpin designation of Panama-based the Waked money laundering organization in May 2016. This action wasn't taken under a terrorism authority, and the press release said nothing about Hezbollah. But when this particular money laundering organization was targeted, it tied up the illicit finances linked to various elements within the Iran threat network, including Hezbollah, and forced them to find other money laundering channels in the region. Much of that activity reportedly shifted to the tri-border area and to Paraguay in particular. Hezbollah criminal enterprises run deep in Africa, as evidenced most recently by the arrest in Morocco of Hezbollah financier Qasim Tajuddin, who's since been extradited to the United States and indicted in Washington, D.C. There are a bunch of steps I think we can do to further the actions we've already taken. The first is to designate additional Hezbollah entities as appropriate. HIFPA prescribes doing business with designated Hezbollah entities. So the more Hezbollah entities designated, the more impactful the legislation will be. This should include, but not be limited to, entities operating in Lebanon. For example, consider the list of Lebanese businesses designated with Lebanon-based IRGC Quds Force operative Hassan Ibrahimi in February. Targeting Hezbollah criminal enterprises in South America and Africa and Europe would be very important as well. Again, think about the Waked money laundering organization and that success. And finally, in this regard, consider follow-on actions to existing designations where appropriate. For example, the IRGC official in Lebanon, Ibrahimi, was providing Hezbollah funds through Hezbollah's Al-Wa'ad construction firm, which we'd already designated in 2009, or this Equip a Mujahid campaign in Lebanon is being run by the Islamic Resistance Support Organization, IRSO, which Treasury already designated back in 2006. Second, we should target Hezbollah criminal support networks of a variety of different types, and I get into those in my testimony. Third, we should consider applying secondary sanctions under HIFPA to financial institutions banking Hezbollah or its associates outside the Middle East. And here, for example, I think we should look at places like Balboa Bank and Trust, which was designated by Treasury in the context of the action taken against the Waked money laundering organization. We should revisit the question of designating Hezbollah a transnational criminal organization, which it absolutely is, without question. We should resume sanctioning Iran for state sponsorship of terrorism. Again, we saw the Ibrahimi action in February, but the Quds Force, Mahan Air, a whole host of other low-hanging fruit Iranian entities involved in Tehran support for terrorism should be designated, and this in no way would jeopardize or conflict with the JCPOA, the Iran deal. And finally, we absolutely must continue to enhance interagency coordination and cooperation against the Iran threat network. That began to fall apart a little bit in the context of the Iran deal, where some agencies wanted to push harder and some did not. Today, there's, I think, greater consensus on the need to push hard on the activities, the malign activities that Iran is engaged in beyond procurement, such as support for terrorism. And I think that there's a lot more we can do here. There are positive signs, and on this I'll conclude. For example, using the Global Counterterrorism Forum, the Law Enforcement and Coordination Group, both to address best practices for countering Hezbollah terrorist, criminal, and other terrorist activities has been a great success. The State Department similarly has used the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund to launch an international initiative in very close partnership with the Department of Justice to raise awareness about Iran and Hezbollah's broad range of terrorist and criminal activities around the world, and to help train our allies around the world to figure out how best to prosecute and deal with those activities. These types of efforts should be doubled down on. There's a lot more we can do. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you. Dr. Asher.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Deutsch, and other members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, thanks for the opportunity to discuss with you the challenges we face countering Hezbollah's rapidly expanding global web of terror, crime, and insurgency, including its direct ties to the United States. I will be brief about the challenges we face in combating Lebanese Hezbollah's illicit web of activities and finances, and begin with a little recounting of how I got involved. Beginning in 2008, in the summer, I had the honor of advising the man on my left and several others in the room at the Drug Enforcement Administration and Department of Treasury, Special Operations Command, Department of State, and Customs Border Protection on developing and spearheading a strategy, a unified strategy across the law enforcement and special operations to pursue Hezbollah's web of activities with the goal of fundamentally disrupting Hezbollah's growing involvement in cocaine trafficking and money laundering, including through the United States financial system and through our own borders. I'm proud to say that a seamless collaborative web of combining a small group of U.S. agencies was established and leveraged to combat these activities using every agency's unique authorities. It's with the sort of whole of government approach that makes you proud about being a part of this government. It's a combination of law enforcement, financial, criminal, civil, and regulatory authorities led to a wide range of actions, which you've heard about, providing a framework to deter, disrupt, publicly illuminate the global illicit Hezbollah network. And I think was probably the most successful operational effort taken against Hezbollah to date by the U.S. government after many years of inaction. Yet, in the last few years of the previous administration, for reasons that most definitely had to do with the Iran deal and concerns of interfering with it, which I thought were totally unfounded as a former nuclear negotiator with Iran and North Korea, we lost.
Pull the microphone a little closer.
We lost much of the altitude that we'd gained in our global effort. And many aspects, including key personnel who were reassigned, budgets that were slashed, many key elements of the investigations that were underway were undermined. It was a bit of a tragedy and a travesty, and I think it was, again, very unfounded. But today we have to deal with the legacy of that and how to rebuild this capability, knowing that you can have a nuclear deal with Iran and you can contain and disrupt their illicit activities and terrorist activities, and we really have to do both. But the result today is that criminal states and criminal terrorist organizations continue to benefit from a type of implicit immunity from prosecution. And Mr. Royce, you and I have gone over this with North Korea over the years. We still haven't seen the types of charges that were assembled against that government, even in the wake of the Sony attacks and more recent hacking of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. Moreover, neither al-Qaeda nor Hezbollah has ever been organizationally prosecuted by the Department of Justice for repeatedly attacking the United States, killing thousands or hundreds of our citizens, and for being tied to a wide range of transnational organized crimes in violation of our laws. And by the way, the same is true with the Islamic State, which I had the honor to be the Deputy Special Coordinator of on the economic warfare side of the State Department a couple years ago. We have not applied mafia-style RICO prosecutions that would aim to incarcerate the members of these organizations for life, take away their sanctuary, strip them of their finances, and undermine their credibility. And I frankly have no good answer why, except that I've heard from people, including Director Comey, that there's a sense of fear that if we do this, it's going to lead to reprisals. I personally spearheaded the targeting of the Lebanese Canadian Bank, a $5.5 billion bank that was at the heart of Hezbollah and Iran's finances in Lebanon. We did not receive retaliation as a nation for bankrupting their largest financial institution. I think the fears are overwrought, and I find the phobias surrounding prosecution of terrorists baseless, bizarre, and moreover, largely against the spirit and the letter of the laws we are sworn to uphold. Today, I would like to highlight that our Department of Justice needs to rebuild, properly fund, and expand capabilities investigations against what I call the Iran Action Network, not just the threat network, Hezbollah's terrorist and military wing, and their friends and partners in criminal states like Venezuela and North Korea. And indeed, we can discuss this, if you'd like, the level of cooperation between the government of Venezuela, the government of Iran, the government of Syria, and Lebanese Hezbollah that we observed in undercover operations that we personally were involved with, including people in this room, was absolutely astonishing. The evidentiary base to take down this entire global network exists. The facts are clear, and they're already revealed in many unsealed indictments. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you have.
Mr. Maltz.
The emerging threats to our country. I lost my brother Michael, U.S. Air Force pararescue, early in the war, and I'm very passionate about national security and public safety issues. During the period I was the director of SOD, I had the privilege of working with numerous law enforcement agencies around the world, the intelligence community, and Department of Defense. We had 30 agencies to include the UK, Australia, Canada, NYPD, and we represented a center that was synchronizing efforts around the globe. I have witnessed the amazing results that have been achieved when agencies share operational intelligence and coordinate their efforts. Unfortunately, I have also witnessed the lost opportunities that have been created when information wasn't shared. In response to September 11th, very smart people in the government decided to form a counter-narcoterrorism center inside the SOD operation. And they had the vision because they knew the nexus between drugs and terrorism and crime was very, very closely tied. So the coordination became really important. Over the years, the nexus has grown. The nexus between crime and terror has grown. It's all about the money. They need money to operate. That's the bottom line. We heard from the experts that they're losing money, they're in bad financial shape, so drug trafficking is very important. We must shut down these funding streams, and we must use all the powerful tools of national power to attack this global threat. We can't investigate terrorism in a cocoon. The American public expect the government to cooperate and share information on these major threat investigations, and we must work very hard to break down the barriers that currently exist between those that investigate criminal groups and those that are responsible for preventing terrorism. We need to develop a mutually supportive framework so the law enforcement actions can enhance intelligence community actions, and vice versa, so intelligence community actions can enhance law enforcement actions. I was the head of SOD when we started this initiative back in 06, 07, looking at global trade-based money laundering, very, very alarming to me. I was fortunate to meet Admiral James Stavridis, the commander of SOUTHCOM, and he showed me a very disturbing visual that I remain on my iPhone today. A fireball when narco-terrorists and Islamic terrorists are joined. That's what I saw in my observations working on Project Cassandra, Operation Titan for almost 10 years. It was alarming that this decorated admiral had the vision back in those days to see what was evolving in South America with the drug traffickers. Unfortunately, based on what I observed, this is what I see every day in my mind, that fireball. Hezbollah is one of the worst terrorist organizations killing all these Americans around the world. It was laundering proceeds of cocaine through the Lebanese Canadian Bank. And they were operating like a major drug cartel. Now in the press, we're hearing about the Captagon all over Syria. And I have some other information on that we can't discuss today. Despite the limited support that our SINTOC task force received, we were very effective in what we were able to do. Project Cassandra was a long-term initiative targeting a very significant organized crime network. We combined the resources and the expertise of some really, really smart people in the government from Treasury, CBP, and other agencies, and including Dr. Asher, and the lead agent in the back, Jack Kelly, who was the catalyst on this operation. We were able to use the tools of national power to make a difference for our country's safety. And we went after this bank very hard, and we did a 311 action. We did civil actions with the Southern District of New York. And we actually seized $150 million from a bank account in Lebanon because of really, really innovative and powerful laws of the United States. And you know what? They felt the pain because they tried to hide the money from us in the LCB, and they moved it to another bank. But we found it because we have some good investigators in this country. Thanks to the SINTOC task force, we actually ultimately forfeited $102 million, and it's in the U.S. Asset Forfeiture Fund. So we're very proud of that work. Investigators documented $300 million moving into the U.S. from Lebanon for the purchase and the shipment of these cars to West Africa. There were 30 businesses named in this particular action. Unfortunately and sadly, there's many more businesses operating that were not affected because of lack of information sharing. Although criminal law enforcement, the intelligence community, and others working on terrorism have come a long way in sharing information, there's a lot more to be done. At this point in this country's history, we don't need any more Inspector General reports talking about lack of information sharing. We need some accountability on the people that aren't sharing. As state sponsorship of terrorism is fueled by drug trafficking, criminal activities on the rise, we have to pay more attention. The Special Operations Division within the Department of Justice established itself as this multi-agency coordination center that can immediately deconflict investigative information, coordinate operation, mitigate threats through its resources and its global capabilities. I would highly recommend that this committee and other members of Congress consider enhancing the special operations capabilities and designate it as the Transnational Organized Crime Center for America. It's critical in my view that we continue to use all the powerful laws and we continue enhancing the laws. There must be open and collaborative efforts between the criminal investigation and the intelligence community because we're in this together. We all are going to face the same consequences if we don't work together. We must illuminate the networks with the really smart people we have in America. We must use every tool, and have an all-tool available approach. As the Senate report adequately and accurately depicted, the Lebanese-Canadian bank investigation served as a model for interagency success. I'm excited and hopeful that the Department of Justice, Homeland Security, under the Trump administration, will examine operations like Project Cassandra and pick out the best lessons learned, and let's move forward. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'd like to discuss this important topic in any details. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maltz. Thank you for your service. Dr. Carlin.
Chairman Royce, Mr. Deutsch, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today. Having examined Hezbollah as a national security policymaker and a researcher for nearly 2 decades, I can confidently say this is a critical time to assess it. To effectively examine Hezbollah's financing, one must consider the political military context, particularly the impact and implications of the Syria conflict. Hezbollah has both benefited from and suffered because of its involvement there. Starting with the latter, support around the region has been shaky as Sunnis around the Middle East watch Hezbollah aid in Syria's destruction. In Lebanon, the Shia see body bags of its youth. With estimates of 5,000 to 10,000 Hezbollah members fighting in Syria, it is hemorrhaging members like never before. Indeed, it has bled more in Syria than in fighting Israel over a much shorter period of time. Hezbollah is waging a counterinsurgency to prop up Assad. The American military has learned over the last decade and a half that this type of conflict is extremely difficult and costly in blood and in treasure. Notable power shifts are at play because of the Syria conflict. The Assad regime owes its continued existence to Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has become a regional player. It has a substantial presence in at least 4 different countries, but is increasingly exerting Iran's mandate. Today, Qasem Soleimani is the decider of Hezbollah's future, not Hassan Nasrallah. The conflict in Syria shifted the dynamics between them, such that Hezbollah seems willing to do whatever Iran wants, whenever it asks, and regardless of the cost. Iran is willing to fight to the last Hezbollah member in Syria, and it appears Hezbollah is too. That is a problem for Hezbollah. Lebanon Shia are isolated, increasingly disillusioned by Hezbollah, but see few protectors. Many of those now joining Hezbollah focus on money. Indeed, 1 out of every 4 Lebanese Shia receives a salary from Hezbollah. Given this, the Lebanese Shia desperately need alternative political representation and new opportunities, particularly in the economic sector. Now, to be sure, Hezbollah has benefited from its involvement in the Syria conflict. 10 years ago, I was most worried about Hezbollah's weapons. Now I'm more worried about the experience Hezbollah has gained. Before, it was a capable military force, good at a limited number of missions. Its portfolio has expanded dramatically. It has become a hardened force, adept at facilitating Iranian power projection around the Middle East. It has learned to command and control a complicated conflict in collaboration with numerous actors. It has acquired substantial experience in diverse environments using increasingly sophisticated weapons. And as the operating space in Syria becomes crowded and the U.S. military deepens its direct involvement there, we could see inadvertent or deliberate interactions with Hezbollah. Now, turning to Lebanon, while the situation appears quiet, one should not be fooled. For a country of a few million brimming with sizable populations of long-term Palestinian refugees and more recent Syrian ones, and 18 or so different confessional groups, it's a miracle Lebanon exists. And that's important to remember. The state has institutions, but they're fragile, they do little in the way of actual governing, and are often beholden to non-state forces or external actors. As you all know well, Lebanon's military is the top recipient of U.S. security assistance. It is in U.S. interest for the military to fight nefarious actors whenever it is willing. Without U.S. support, its ability to do so is minimal. It has deployed throughout much of Lebanon and taken important, albeit insufficient, steps to counter violent actors. The Lebanese military is flawed, but it is nationally supported and well respected, in a country with few institutions that can be described as such. It has an impeccable record of maintaining control over its weapons over the last decade. And of course, Hezbollah doesn't need the Lebanese military's weapons. It has Tehran and Damascus for that. Hezbollah poses the most potent threat to Lebanon's internal security. It turned its weapons on the Lebanese people in 2008, and it will do so again if necessary. There's a memorial to the Civil War at the front of Lebanon's Ministry of Defense, composed of weapons collected from various groups melted together. You will not, however, find Hezbollah's stockpile in that hunk of rusting metal. As you seek to legislate further action against Hezbollah, I urge you to ask the following questions. To the White House, is the strategy focused on ISIL, or does it include the Assad regime? To the intelligence community, how are Iran, Syria, and Russia adjusting their support for and/or collaboration with Hezbollah in Syria? What points of friction exist between them and Hezbollah? Can they be exploited? And what about between the Lebanese Shia and Hezbollah? To the state and defense departments, how are they regularly assessing their program to strengthen the Lebanese military? And to the Defense Department, how is the U.S. military accounting for the increased potential of U.S.-Hezbollah confrontation in and around Syria? Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I could just ask a question here on, I guess, a striking lesson in life, which is the zeal for the deal, which becomes eventually a deal at any cost, how people get caught up on that. In April, it was reported that the Justice and the State Departments in the Obama administration denied or delayed requests from prosecutors and agents to lure some key Iranian fugitives to friendly countries so that they could be arrested for procuring material for Iran's nuclear program. And this is something that Dr. David Albright spoke to before this committee, the former UN weapons inspector. He testified that out of a misplaced fear of negatively affecting the deal, the Obama administration also interfered in U.S. law enforcement efforts. So it is with interest to note Dr. Asher's testimony this morning, because in that testimony he says, in narrow pursuit of the Iran nuclear agreement, the administration actively mitigated investigations and prosecutions needed to effectively dismantle Hezbollah and the Iran Action Network. Senior leadership presiding, directing, and overseeing various sections within the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of State, and portions of the U.S. intelligence community, systematically disbanded any action that threatened to derail the administration's policy agenda focused on Iran. So I was going to ask Dr. Asher what detail you could give us on that, and maybe ask Mr. Maltz your opinion as well. Dr. Asher?
Well, I had the unfortunate experience of being at the State Department, coming back to work on the counter-ISIL economic warfare plan as the coordinator for under General Allen. So I saw a lot of this happening, even though this was after I departed the Hezbollah effort, largely because it was being defunded inside the DOD. So I saw a lot of this, directly. We had money flowing, pallets and pallets of money flowing to Iran. There was a lot of stuff. Let's recall, in fairness, the Bush administration stripped the Department of Justice of its authorities to indict the government of North Korea, to pursue the North Korea nuclear program, which we had a very sophisticated plan to destroy.
Another case of the zeal for the deal.
So another case of the zeal for the deal. I predicted to my colleagues that by the end of the Obama administration, we'd see the same dynamic. So I don't think this is like I think it's sort of a bipartisan syndrome, okay? It's not blame the Obama administration, blame the Bush administration. There's something about people wanting to have a deal at almost any cost. And in the case of the Iran deal, there's a lot of things around here talk about the nuclear negotiations, but there's no provision, as we discussed before, in outsourcing, even though they built a North Korean nuclear reactor in Syria right under our noses, right under the six-party talks. So there's a lot of holes in this cheese. Law enforcement didn't have to be one of them, and it doesn't have to be one of them. People respect, including in Iran and Lebanon, when laws are enforced. The arrest recently of Qasem Tajuddin, one of the most important super facilitators for Iran and Hezbollah, has sent a shockwave through the leadership of Hezbollah and the Iranian regime. The fact that we've got him in prison here and that maybe he might cooperate, I'm sure that's gotten their attention. We had the ability, I can't comment on those two operations, which I am aware of, that were essentially aborted, but we had many more that we were inhibited from acting on for political reasons. We had operations that were denied overseas. We had funding that was cut. People were making a decision that the counterterrorism mission and the Iran nuclear deal was a central and all-important element. whereas containing Iran's malevolent forces was less important. I think you can do both, and we have to do both. And I don't think it's an either or. And if the Iranians don't like it, too bad. You know, they blew up our embassy twice. They killed hundreds of Marines. They went after us in Iraq when I was working with the Special Operations Task Force in support of them there, and killed nearly 800 Americans with explosively formed projectiles designed by Hezbollah. I have a beef against these people, obviously, and we have the tools, thanks to the great work of the DEA and other law enforcement agencies, to take them apart financially, economically, politically, and strategically using law enforcement, which the world will respect.
And maybe also I'll ask Mr. Maltz, what steps do we need to take? What steps does Congress need to take to rebuild our enforcement capabilities there?
Well, like I said, sir, the Special Operations Division has a history of success. As a matter of fact, you were very, very supportive in the Victor Boot case. The last time I was before you was when you supported the DEA on the extradition of Victor Boot. So I will never forget that. Thank you.
And by the way, it sends a powerful message to a lot of other miscreants on this globe, the fact that he's behind bars, and thank you very much for your success in that effort.
So, sir, on that note, SOD had this counter-narco-terrorism operations center for the purpose of coordinating these type of investigations. We created that to provide a unity of effort. That is the purpose, because we are in this together. You cannot separate out the terrorist aspects and the criminal aspects, because at the end of the day, it's what's in the best interest of the U.S. government. So I compliment some folks in the government, in the Department of Justice, and Admiral McCraven specifically, because we organized a U.S. government interagency effort on this threat. And every agency that came to the table agreed that Hezbollah was a priority against the United States. So the idea was to put all the resources on the table. We went down to Florida for this big government meeting where the Attorney General, the Department of Homeland Security Director, and all these other officials were there. So the idea would be, let's put the stuff on the table and work together. As soon as we left the meeting and as soon as Admiral McCraven retired, it fell apart, in my view. And I was the one in charge of the operation at SOD, so I could say that very clearly. And so for me, how the heck can you have an action against this organization running in the Southern District of New York, the best in the country, and interagency did not come together and provide the necessary information to make it a more powerful action? So we had the right concept, but we didn't complete the deal. You know how upset I was when I saw the Wall Street Journal article at the end of last year? Very accurate article. The car parks are booming in West Africa because the business is booming. We had a chance to knock them dead, and we held back because of interagency cooperation. So we have to end it.
We're going to return to that issue. I got to go to Mr. Deutsch, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for really excellent presentations. Dr. Carlin, you said that Qasem Soleimani is now the decider of Hezbollah's future, and you talked about using Hezbollah for Iranian power projection. My question is how that's done, and whether it's Iraq or Yemen, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi, are you suggesting that Hezbollah, or could you speak to whether Hezbollah is more than just a model for the terrorist groups looking to act in those countries and is in fact playing an operational role, and if so, how broadly?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Deutsch. Hezbollah is the best design model Iran could have really hoped for in a number of ways. And I think when you look at sort of attempts to build a similar force, say Iranian support to the Houthis, it's just not going to be equivalent for domestic Yemeni reasons, among others. But I think for those of us who spent so long looking at Hezbollah, it was always a question of, if Iran asked Hezbollah to get involved in circumstances that would be really problematic domestically, what would Hezbollah do, right? This was particularly thought of if there were some sort of entanglement between Israel and Iran. What would Hezbollah do if this ended up being a problem? And what we have seen is because Hezbollah can only play its singular role in Lebanon with Iran's weapons, what's happening now is existential for it. And so this debate that used to occur doesn't occur anymore. Indeed, any thoughts Nasrallah might have are kind of immaterial. If someone like Qasem Soleimani needs Hezbollah to go bleed in Syria, he doesn't really have a choice anymore, which is why you see not just the bleeding in Syria, which is obviously really problematic from a domestic and regional support perspective, but Hezbollah getting involved in training Houthis in Yemen, also not core to its interests really at all, but it doesn't have a whole lot of options here. And we've seen this ability so that when we put on, say, U.S. Defense Department hat, we worry, of course, one worries about Iran's conventional military, but it's the ability to build these violent non-state actors like Hezbollah and then deploy them in various circumstances against their own interest in really problematic and lethal ways.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Levit, in 2012, bipartisan group of members began sending letters to our EU partners urging them to designate Hezbollah. In 2013, they declared Hezbollah's military wing a terrorist organization. But as I mentioned earlier in my comments, the U.S. and others don't make this distinction between political and military wings. What impact would a full designation from the EU have on Hezbollah's ability to operate on the continent, and what more could the U.S. be doing now to encourage the EU to declare Hezbollah in its entirety to be a terrorist organization?
Thank you for the question. When this was going on, my book on Hezbollah had just been finished and spent 8 months with Georgetown University Press, God bless him, till it came out. That gave me an opportunity to make 7, 8, 9 different trips to Europe, Brussels, and most capitals at the time, trying to push them on this issue. Some of their concerns are some of the concerns you heard earlier about reprisals, about who are we to ban an entity that is duly elected in Lebanon. For many of the governments, however, at the end of the day, their decision to ban even part of Hezbollah, the military and terrorist wing, had nothing to do with what terrorism Hezbollah had carried out around the world, let alone in Europe, but had everything to do with Syria. And so that provided us a real opportunity. What the legislation in Europe does already is it gives us an opportunity to go to the Europeans and get them to cooperate with us on Hezbollah investigations related to the terrorism and military activities. But Hezbollah is a large movement, and it doesn't operate a Hezbollah Terrorism Incorporated, and so it's often very difficult to explain to the Europeans or prove to the Europeans an open source in a way that they can go public with, that an entity we want to target with them is in fact related to the military and terrorist wing and not just politics or social welfare. Banning all of Hezbollah would end that debate and discussion, and it would stop giving Hezbollah a pass in which it could just, through basic front organizations and money laundering, pretend that something is a legitimate actor, part of their quote-unquote legitimate side of the house, when in fact it is supporting or also supporting its terrorist and military activities. If I may, to follow up also on the earlier question relating to this, I don't think we can just target Hezbollah anymore. We need to bring this into a larger picture in targeting the Iran threat or the Iran action network more broadly, in particular the Shia militias that are now so active in Iraq and in Syria. I think the likelihood that we could see some direct conflict between U.S. forces and these, including Hezbollah and Tanf in the southern Syria, is very, very real. And what we need to realize is that many of these Shia militants are not going to go back to being farm assistant farmers when the immediate conflict is over in Iraq or in Syria. And that means that we're seeing right now, right before our eyes, the creation of an Iranian Foreign Legion of people who could go and do things for them in that asymmetric kind of way that Mara was talking about. Reminds me of Hezbollah and Iran's proxies right after, just a few years after the Iranian Revolution, where Iran wanted attacks carried out against U.S. and other interests, say, for example, in Kuwait. And they sent Hezbollah operatives and they sent Iraqi Shia operatives, some of the same people operating today, people like Hadi al-Amri, people like Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the very same people. These relationships go back 30 years. And we need to be targeting, of course, Hezbollah, but not only Hezbollah.
Thank you very much.
With the Europeans as well.
We go to Eliana Ross-Leitonen.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member. Hezbollah is one of the most dangerous and formidable terror organizations in the world, responsible for some of history's most notorious terror attacks. And as Dr. Carlin noted, Hezbollah is more than just a partner in the Iranian regime. It's an extension of Iran's IRGC Quds force and is fulfilling Tehran's every wish, including propping up the murderous Assad regime in Syria, a mission which has only increased Hezbollah's sophistication, its stockpiles, its capabilities. We cannot ignore Hezbollah's influence and control over the Lebanese state, and by extension, the Lebanese Armed Forces, or LAF. In your written testimony, Dr. Carlin, you state that the LAF is, quote, easily manipulated, end quote, and, quote, only as capable as its political leadership permits, end quote. So if the LAF is easily manipulated and Hezbollah has such a large influence over Lebanese institutions, how can we in the U.S. reconcile U.S. support for the ALF? And I'd like to hear the other witnesses respond to that also. And even with some of the safeguards that are in place, are we not running the risk of U.S. assistance to the ALF indirectly helping Hezbollah?
Thank you for that question. If I might start with a little bit of history, the very first time I went to Lebanon was during the Syrian occupation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Carlin. I do appreciate history, but I only got 3 minutes.
Of course.
So how can we reconcile, how can both things be true? It's LAF is easily manipulated, it's only as capable as the political leadership permits, and yet we support the LAF. It's confusing, yes?
Ideally, we want the Lebanese government to be able to secure its territory, right? To have a monopoly on violence. And the more that there are violent non-state actors that exist and proliferate around Lebanon, whether it's groups like Hezbollah or it's groups within the refugee camps, like we have seen with Fatah al-Islam historically, the more that we want the Lebanese military to be capable of trying to shrink that operating space.
Thank you. And how about the other witnesses, if you care to comment?
The other witnesses are all pointing at me. I would just say that you're absolutely right. It is complicated. The LAF has done some very good things in taking the fight to the Islamic State, for example. But the LAF is compromised, even as it is the most basic glue that holds the Lebanese state together. So I think what we need to do is try and have as much influence with the LAF as possible and understand that our expectations need to be limited. And that means that explains why sometimes we are very careful about what weapon systems we provide them.
Thank
For
you.
example, what type of
And let me
helicopter.
just get to one last question. The U.S. government has issued an interagency report stating that there are links, as we've discussed, between cigarette smuggling and terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah. Do you have any recommendations on what we can do in Congress or the administration should do to clamp down on this source of funding for Hezbollah and other terrorist groups?
I mean, there's no doubt we saw in many cases the cigarettes being moved in the same ways, same routes, same facilitation networks as the cocaine. So one of the best ways to do this is a public-private partnership. I had a great opportunity when I was running the North Korea Illicit Activities Initiative to actually partner with the Secret Service and the Philip Morris Corporation. It actually worked. We let the people affected by the cigarettes underwrite some of the law enforcement activities, and we got support from members like.
So you would recommend?
I think we can do a lot together with the private sector to go after this, but we need to have a joint task force. This is the most important element because these are polymorphic crimes. It's not just cocaine smuggling or Captagon. They're basically doing anything they can make a buck on, and cigarette smuggling is definitely one of them.
Thank you. Any other comments? Thank you, Mr.
I would just say that, in my experience, one of the last cases that I was involved with at the SOD was another very disturbing trend. Groups from Yemen operating all over the United States involved with cigarette, untaxed cigarettes, K2 and spice, EBT fraud, counterfeit goods, and sending millions and millions of dollars right back to Yemen. So we have these global trade-based schemes going on from America back to these countries. So we have to step up the efforts.
Thank you so much. Mr. Schneider?
Yes, I think Mr. Brad Snyder is next.
Thank you, and I again want to thank the committee for calling this hearing, the witnesses for your testimony, but also for your long and dedicated work on this issue. We've talked in this hearing quite a bit about the link between Iran and Hezbollah, Hezbollah's international activity, the impact of Syria. Dr. Carlin, I think you said it very well. What I would look for, and I'm anxious to understand better, is the administration's strategy for the Levant and how we take that on. I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to say I want to see it, and we can talk about it later. But I'd like to bring an issue that we haven't talked about here, and that's Russia's involvement with Hezbollah. To what extent, and maybe I'll turn it to you, Dr. Carlin, what extent have you seen Russia cooperation with Hezbollah in Syria?
Thank you for that question. At a tactical and operational level, we have seen Russian air cover for Hezbollah ground movements. We have seen the likelihood of joint operating centers. That's worrisome. What worries me a lot more is that Russia's military, if you followed its modernization over the last few years, has gotten pretty good. And I worry about Hezbollah learning about things like how to use cyber warfare, how to use electronic warfare. It's worth noting, however, that strategically, this is a relationship of convenience. This conflict is existential for Hezbollah in Syria. It is not for the Russians.
But I know it was reported last year in the Daily Beast, I believe, that Russia was providing Hezbollah long-range tactical missiles, other material. Have you seen that? And is there any evidence that the relationship's going to outlast the Syrian conflict?
I have not seen evidence of that beyond those reports, which I have also read. Russia has its own problems with groups like Hezbollah, which is why I still see this as a relationship of convenience rather than an actual partnership or alliance. And indeed, it is conceivable that the Russians will want to come to a serious negotiation on Syria way before Hezbollah will, because it's just not in their interest for the Syria conflict to turn out any other way than Assad remaining in power.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Levit, in a little different direction. You talked to a fair amount about the Hezbollah International Financing Prevention Act, and thank you for your help with that. Broader question, what metrics should we be using to determine whether or not it's working, and what steps we should take further to push forward?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for your leadership on the Hezbollah International Finance Prevention Act. You were involved in this from the very, very beginning before many others were. I think there are so many tools here, and we were using some of them, as you heard, and then we all but stopped. And in order to have a real effect, you have to have some continuity. There were prosecutions that were put on ice. There were designations that didn't happen. I think the fact that Qasem Tajuddin that we worked with the Moroccans, he was arrested in Morocco, he was extradited to the United States, he's now here in Washington, D.C., in custody, been indicted. That, I think, is a very, very positive sign. But there's a lot more that has to happen across the interagency, the type of interagency cooperation that we've had in the past and we now need to have moving forward that you've heard from myself and from my colleagues. I also think we lost a real opportunity when, under the original HIFPA, the decision on whether or not to designate Hezbollah as a transnational organized criminal enterprise was given not to law enforcement, but to the DNI. And that decision was largely politicized and didn't move forward. It really boggled the mind. I wrote about it at the time. There may be reasons to decide not to move forward with it that I would disagree with, but there is no question that Hezbollah operates as a transnational organized criminal enterprise, and to designate them as such would really not only tar and feather them, but give us even more opportunities to target them. And again, I think that Mark Carlin is right, that Qasem Soleimani is calling the shots more than anybody else. And the reason for that is because Hezbollah is so incredibly beholden to Iran for funds and weapons and its position, which means that we need to be targeting not only Hezbollah operatives, but also the Iranian operatives and entities that are overseeing this relationship, which means getting comfortable with the idea of holding Iran's feet to the fire for its support for terrorism in particular, leave the human rights and ballistic missiles aside, which we should be doing as well, in the context of the Iran deal. This does not undermine or cross the Iran deal.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time, so let me just reiterate. I agree with you. I think we have to hold Iran to account for its activities, not just support of terrorism throughout the world. It's also its activities within the region and its human rights activities at home. And I agree with what you said earlier. I don't think that threatens the JCPOA. So again, I thank you to the witnesses, and with that, I'll yield back.
We go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on, again, another really important issue for safety of our country. Let me ask some fundamental questions on, is Hezbollah, the people who make up Hezbollah, are they all Palestinians? No. Tell me what Hezbollah is made up of then.
Hezbollah is a Lebanese group. It's not a Palestinian group.
Okay,
It's
but
comprised primarily
know,
of Lebanese Shia.
I guess the reason I was asking that is that we know that large numbers of Palestinians went to Lebanon, and I assumed that that was the group that eventually became Hezbollah. That's not correct?
No.
Okay.
When it was founded, it got support from Fatah and other Palestinian groups, to be sure, Imad Mughni and others. It does also see other subunits. There is a Sunni subunit that includes some Palestinians called the Resistance Brigades, but that's not Hezbollah.
So they're Lebanese?
Yes.
Rohrabacher, I can assure you that Imad Mughni himself studied at the financial feet of Yasser Arafat. And it isn't interesting and operationally, but financially, we have a very substantial relationship between Palestinian Islamic Jihad financiers and Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, i.e. the terrorist wing. So it's a very interesting question. And they're based around a place called Borj al-Baranja, which is near the airport. That was the historical base of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It's interesting that you know that there's so much of the Hezbollah terrorist and military wing activity right there as well.
Sir, if I might add, I've been to Borj al-Barajna, and it's worth noting that actually traditionally the relationship between Hezbollah and the Palestinians in Lebanon is quite fraught, because the Palestinians in Lebanon are Sunni, Hezbollah is Shia, and when the Palestinian refugees came to Lebanon, they threw off a very delicate confessional balance. So it is a very complicated
Yes, it is very complicated, and that's the reason why I asked that question. I have always been under the assumption that, yes, they were from Lebanon, but they were basically Palestinian refugees, now Lebanese. So thank you for clarifying that. What is the budget for Hezbollah? Do we have an overall budget, anybody?
No.
No?
Hundreds of millions
Hundreds
at a
of
minimum, but I've seen no open source, and I've seen no open source
And do they
good
put
numbers
those
for their
hundreds
overall
of
budget.
millions in a bank somewhere?
Pardon?
Do they put those hundreds of millions in a bank? Do they have the bank accounts that we?
So
that
when
may
we
be- I thought
got
that's what this was
inside
all
the
about
Lebanese
today.
Canadian bank, which we did one way or another, we observed billions of dollars that were under the control both of Lebanese Hezbollah, and we knew which accounts they were and how much money was in them through unclassified means, as well as Iranian money, and it was billions of dollars too.
And what
So
banks were that, was that again?
the Lebanese Canadian bank, but there were many others that were part of a network. So everything we saw was larger than anyone expected. And the other thing was the connection to money laundering and drug trafficking proceeds was much greater than we ever expected.
Okay, so if we know they're got billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars in these banks, can't we do something about that? Aren't we just, if nothing else, I mean, we could use our ability to hack into systems and destroy their bank accounts.
Sir, like I said before, we did identify 150 million
Right.
sitting in a bank, Labano Banco Francés, and we did, because of the great work in the U.S. with the Southern District of New York, seized 150 million. They transferred the money to the U.S. Marshal's account from Lebanon, and we forfeited 102 million.
Congratulations on that.
But there's
Why
a lot
aren't we
more.
why aren't we doing more of it then?
Well,
They're still there.
if we get the interagency task force together and we enforce some accountability on the folks involved, then we can do a lot more.
Okay, I've got just a couple more seconds here. Let me just note that we have recently seen an attack on Iran, and the Iranian government, the mullahs, believe that Sunni forces have attacked them. This may signal a ratcheting up of certain commitments by the United States of America. And as far as I'm concerned, I just want to make this point and see what you think. Isn't it a good thing for us to have the United States finally backing up Sunnis who will attack Hezbollah and the Shiite threat to us? Isn't that a good thing? And if so, maybe this is a Trump, maybe it's a Trump strategy of actually supporting one group against another, considering that you have two terrorist organizations.
Those attacks were claimed by the Islamic State. It's never in our interest to support a terrorist group like the Islamic State. We should condemn the attacks in Iran as we would condemn any act of terrorism, even as we hold Iran accountable for its sponsorship of terror.
Even so, that's like Joe Stalin was a horrible guy. We must never associate with horrible guys like that, even to get Hitler. And so maybe it's a good idea to have radical Muslim terrorists fighting each other. I'll leave it at that.
I mean,
Thank
having
you.
coordinated the economic warfare plan against the Islamic State, I would not condone an attack by the Islamic State, match like mad. I would be determined to destroy them
I
financially.
think,
So Hezbollah
I think
is-
we'd need to go to Joaquin Castro here from Texas for his time. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, the witnesses, for being here today and for your testimony. Dr. Carlin, I wanted to follow up on a point that you were making, or ask a question based on a point that you made. We know that Russia has assisted and helped Hezbollah, and of course, we've been dealing in our nation with the prowess of Russia's cyber capabilities and their abilities for cyber malfeasance. Can you talk about your concern, if you have a concern, that they are sharing this information or this ability, these capabilities with groups like Hezbollah? And do we have an assessment of what Hezbollah's cyber capabilities are right now and terrorist groups like them?
Thank you for that question. I have not seen an unclassified assessment of Hezbollah's cyber capabilities. What I might say on the Russian military front, and my most recent job as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy and Force Development meant I spent a lot of time thinking about Russian military modernization and the trajectory that it's on. And it's pretty worrisome because not only do we see Russian investments in kind of weapons like its nuclear stockpile, but we also see some worrisome doctrine. So the Russians have what's known as the Gerasimov doctrine, escalate to de-escalate. The idea is that if I punch you, you should punch me a whole lot harder so that I give up. That's a pretty dangerous doctrine to play around with. And I worry about Hezbollah not necessarily getting the weapons from Russia, but I worry about them watching how Russia uses its doctrine, employs its doctrine, and then maybe starting to use it itself, say, vis-a-vis Israel.
But certainly they could be trained in some of these essentially capabilities.
Oh, absolutely conceivable.
Sure. And then it's interesting. Obviously, we consider Hezbollah a terrorist organization, but they also have some measure of political control in municipal governments in Lebanon, parliament seats, which makes them almost a hybrid of a state actor and a non-state actor, versus ISIS, right, which doesn't seek to elect people, at least as far as we can tell, in the same way in politics. So let me ask you guys, what do you see them as? You see them as a state actor or as a non-state actor? I open that up to the panel.
Thanks for the question. You're right, they're both, but we need to see them as a non-state actor in terms of the explicitly illicit conduct that they're conducting around the world as a transnational criminal organization, as a terrorist organization, as a militia independent of Lebanon. They're able to do that function even as they run for municipal government and they run for parliament and they hold ministerial positions because we allow it. If you allow an organization that, independent of the country, does all these other things, then also, by the way, has people run for office, then it can pretend to have more legitimacy than it is. But I think Mara Carlin was right. The greatest threat to Lebanon on so many levels, financial, stability, is Hezbollah. And I think it's in part our fault, the international community's fault, as Mr. Deutsch suggested, for failing to see Hezbollah holistically as a group that, whatever else it's involved in, it is very much involved in a whole host of explicitly illicit activities, as Mara pointed out, that have nothing to do with the interests of Lebanon, even its interests as a party in Lebanon. So ultimately, it's a non-state actor that engages in some state activities because it benefits them to do so.
Mr. Castro, I couldn't agree more with Matt's comments. I might just add that the weaker the Lebanese state is, the better it is for Hezbollah.
Just if I could add, that we identified publicly, DEA, the business affairs component of the Islamic Jihad terrorist wing of Hezbollah, the military wing of Hezbollah, as at the center of the narco-trafficking, money laundering conspiracy that involved the Lebanese Canadian Bank, a massive number of cells in Europe distributing cocaine coming into the United States. So there's no doubt, and I'm not trying to say we shouldn't go after the entire organization, designate the entire organization, but the case that could be made from most directly from a law enforcement perspective, just following the facts, would tie the terrorist wing under Ahmad Magnia, who died, and his successor, and his business manager, Adham Tabaja, who we designated, to the cocaine money laundering. So there is a strategy that could be pursued where we go after the business affairs component of Islamic Jihad, charge Islamic Jihad for having blown up our embassies and killed our people, and we leave the rest of Hezbollah sort of off to the side. That is an option that some prosecutors have advocated, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily really comporting with the facts fully.
Sure.
Look, I'll just add to that. This is where people get most uncomfortable, right? If you really dig down to the information, you will find time and again that the quote-unquote political or social welfare leadership is involved in all of this illicit activity. The business affairs component was directly tied to Abdullah Safiuddin. Safiuddin is a political senior Hezbollah official. And so for those who are uncomfortable recognizing that Hezbollah actually is one holistic entity, for those who are uncomfortable with the consequences of having to follow the evidence to where it leads, that may explain why some people are hesitant to do so. It's inexcusable. We should be following the evidence where it takes us, whether it's in a murder case or a bank robbery case or a terrorism case.
Thank you. You, Patrick.
Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, panel. Generally speaking, maybe it's Dr. Levit and Dr. Asher, why shouldn't the U.S. Treasury Department sanction the Central Bank of Lebanon?
The simple answer is because they're actually very good partners. The Central Bank of Lebanon put out a circular making sure that the Lebanese financial system would enforce things like HIFBA, and did a very good job of doing so. As Mara said before, completely destabilizing Lebanon, destabilizing the financial system there is not in our interest. And of the partners we have, they're one of the best.
Are they facilitating payments that benefit Hezbollah?
I can't answer that question in any specificity. Because Hezbollah is such a large footprint in the Lebanese economy, it's likely that happens at some point. Would you, by targeting the Lebanese Central Bank, at the end of the day, have a net benefit? No.
Okay. Why shouldn't the department sanction Iranian banks for which sanctions were lifted under the JCPOA? Anybody?
Yeah, my colleagues keep looking at me. It's fine. I think that we need to be careful that banks that were delisted, when we look at them for relisting or we look at other banks, we're very, very careful and specific to make sure that we're doing these under the authorities that still exist, and they do exist. There will be people who will tell you you can't redesignate an Iranian entity that was taken off the list, but if it was taken off a proliferation list and it is still today involved, for example, in sponsorship of terrorism, it absolutely can and should be
right?
considered for designation.
Okay.
Like we're legally mandated, essentially, to do this. I mean, I think that's something from your oversight perspective, Mr. Perry, that, you can remind people. We have a legal responsibility to enforce this act, and we can't willfully ignore the facts. I've unfortunately seen a lot of willful ignorance.
You can't use the
in my career.
JCPOA to be derelict in your duty, right?
That's right.
And that's what's happening in too many cases.
It is happening.
Considering their intensifying international criminal activities, is there any reason the administration shouldn't consider designating Hezbollah as a transnational criminal organization?
They absolutely should. As I said in my testimony, and get into more detail in the written testimony, we should revisit this immediately.
Is there any disagreement among the panel? Some of the most lucrative activities happen in the TBA, the tri-border area. Can any of you talk about the current measures and what additional measures should be included regarding their criminal syndicate activities in Latin America, et cetera? Anybody?
All I could say, sir, is
Yes, sir.
that when I was the head of the SOD, we saw a lot of cocaine leaving the TBA, going all over to the world, working closely with folks in Venezuela, connected to the highest levels of the government in Venezuela. But as far as currently, I can't give you an accurate assessment of what they're seeing in the TBA now.
And what's your recommendation for continued or further action in that regard?
Again, like I've said all along, the best recommendation I can give to this committee, it has to start with information sharing. Let's stop pushing that under the rug, get the experts together in a room, designate these as priorities. Every agency should be mandated to put the information on the table and then focus on the targets. And that's not happening.
If I could just say, I think the most powerful current way for the Department of Justice to impose a huge legal penalty against Lebanese Hezbollah, including its terrorist wing, would be to actively prosecute the government of Nicolas Maduro and his associates, including Tariq al-Assami, his executive vice president, for their involvement in complicity and active conduct in cooperating with Hezbollah in narco-trafficking, money laundering on an international scale.
Okay. Just got a couple.
If I can add one last
Sure.
thing there. Again, under HIFPA, we can apply secondary sanctions, and as I described in my testimony at length, so I won't describe it now, we can and should be looking for secondary sanctions, financial institutions with which we could hit secondary sanctions, in particular in South America, and after the Waqid money laundering organization was shut, saw a lot of that movement into the tri-border area, Paraguay in particular. There are no shortage of targets.
Okay. Dr. Asher, Dr. Levit, and Mr. Maltz, and I guess Dr. Carlin as well. I did some time in Iraq. I just want, if you can, in the few moments that are remaining, discuss the role of Iraqi financial institutions and businesses in enabling Hezbollah in Iran.
Well, we do know that in the wake of the original HIFPA legislation, some Hezbollah money was moved out of Lebanon for fear that it wasn't quite as safe there as it once might have been, and that was, some of it was moved, we understand, to places like Dubai and to Iraq. The first order of business is try and pressure the Iraqi government to work as closely with us as possible in ways that they already have, for example, on countering the Islamic State financing, exchange houses, et cetera. Then short of that, if there are illicit banks that are still providing these types of services knowingly, then we should consider the secondary sanctions option. But that doesn't need to be our first choice. But we definitely need to be working further on the financial system as it relates to these
Based
threats.
on open source commercial records, you can see a very significant movement of Hezbollah financial operatives tied to the business affairs component of Islamic Jihad into Iraq in the last few years. They've established a whole string of businesses in the south in partnership with Iraqi militant groups. It's obviously part of some sort of strategy that they're executing for their Iranian friends.
Just for clarification, in the south, do you mean in places like Basra and Nasiriyah?
Yes, but also into the southern belts of Baghdad as well, so you see it in some of the mixed areas. They have a sort of economic action plan that they're executing to infiltrate the Iraqi economy, with the Lebanese playing a much more significant role as Arabs.
We go now to Dan Donovan from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Levit, during your testimony, you talked about we should again sanction Iran. Last year, the United States government paid Iran $1.7 billion to their government. The official purpose of that was a payment for $400 million for a contract for military weapons from decades ago. The remaining $1.3 billion was the interest that was collected on that $400 million while it remained in the United States. If we're going to sanction countries, if we're going to sanction entities, what kind of message do we send them when they're receiving a benefit for us freezing their assets in the United States, that $1.3 billion that they gained in interest?
So that action was, I believe, an unfortunate but a technical action in terms of the interest. The interest was there. Whether that had to be done or not is another discussion for another time. My feeling is we are where we are. That happened. There's no undoing that. And what we need to do, I believe, in keeping with the Iran deal, whether you like the Iran deal or not, whether I like the Iran deal or not, is to hold Iran's feet to the fire on its continuing illicit conduct, because that was how the deal was sold to us. We were told by previous administration officials time and again that we would continue to hold their feet on the fire, to the fire on these issues. We need to. It does not violate the deal to do so. The problem is, because we didn't do anything, Iran's been emboldened. Because we didn't do anything, and Iran went around the world, including the governor of the central bank, who came here and spoke in Washington, D.C. at the Council on Foreign Relations and elsewhere and said the era of sanctions is over, people started buying that narrative. That narrative is false. And so the first thing we need to do is push back on that narrative with our European and Asian allies, make them understand, I hope, that, because we are where we are, that we will hold up to the letter of the Iran deal, which means enforcing terrorism, ballistic missile, and human rights sanctions.
So I have on my cell phone some pictures that were sent to me by a financial source who's not a U.S. government source. I do some work for financial institutions on anti-money laundering and sanctions compliance, and that source sent me pictures of $1 billion in 2 pallets of shrink-wrapped U.S. Federal Reserve $100 bill notes that were being moved through a European country into West Africa, into a South American country by Iranian agents, it appears, to set up some sort of port-to-port scheme, perhaps involving narcotics trafficking. Whether the money is the money that was given by my State Department colleagues, unfortunately in my mind, or not, you don't see $1 billion in palletized cash with Federal Reserve Bank of New York symbols on them, the wrappers, every day. The fact is that money's being moved around for operational and devious reasons. I don't think it contributed whatsoever to creating a more peaceful relationship with the Iranian people.
You know, I always ask witnesses when they testify before us that we're lawmakers, and, you know, we create laws, and we have to ask experts like you, what laws would you like to see Congress create that would achieve the goals that we all have here? Would each of you be able to just tell me for a moment what you would think about a law that would prohibit a terrorist organization or a state terrorist organization from receiving a benefit of having their assets in the United States Bank?
I just say, I think we need to demand, you, sir, if you could, and your members, colleagues, that the RICO, Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act, which terrorism is a predicate for RICO, be used assiduously against the major terrorist organizations to go after their members, their money, and their facilities, knowing that we can use long-arm statutes like we did against this bank, Libano France, to go after their money in correspondent bank accounts here, even if we can't get to it in Lebanon or Iran or somewhere in the Middle East. So RICO is an absolutely central feature. It doesn't need to be legislated, but you could encourage its use. It's never been used in a large way other than against the FARC, and that was quite successful.
And as Dr. Levit had said earlier, if we designate Hezbollah as a criminal enterprise, RICO then would be available to us.
Yeah, RICO's available anyway. That would provide other benefits, but we could do RICO yesterday.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the risk of, let me see how gentle I can be. I think we've missed the target here as we discuss in this very meaningful and worthwhile hearing attacking Hezbollah's financial network. Tangentially, certainly we've discussed Iran, but I've got a rather convoluted line chart here that I've done that shows Iran giving what's estimated to be, depending upon your source, open source, $60 to $200 million a year to Hezbollah. The IRGC controlling the entire black economy in Iran and large portions of the above-ground economy in Iran. And just on the black economy side, controlling revenue between $25 and $50 billion a year, and them supporting Iran. We've got drug ops in Lebanon supporting Hezbollah, but the drug ops in Lebanon really took off after the Syrian civil war escalated, creating a vacuum, and when the LAF stopped patrolling the fields and the areas in the Bekaa Valley, we saw a skyrocketing of production of drugs. So that was caused largely by Iran, who now has co-opted the LAF to the point now where I recently read an article that said, quote, the distinction between Hezbollah and the Lebanese state is meaningless. In fact, the Lebanese president is a Hezbollah ally, and the Lebanese were the only nation not to sign the resolution condemning the attacks on the Saudi consulate and embassy in Iran. And so what we see here is we're talking about Hezbollah, but that's a branch on a tree. The tree should be called Iran. The roots of the tree should be called the IRGC. And if you want to solve the long-term problem, we need to take on the IRGC. One of these gentlemen, and I apologize because I was copiously taking notes, so I don't know which of you it was, said we need to hold up to the agreement of the JCPOA, which I not jokingly refer to as the JCPOS. You can figure that one out, which means enforcing ballistic missile sanctions. And I quote, hold up to the agreements of the JCPOA, which means enforcing ballistic missile sanctions. I wish, and I don't know how to do this because I'm new here, that I could have read into the record an article from, of all places, NPR, which points out that the JCPOA is so tragically flawed that the lawyers that wrote it should be disbarred. Let me read to you from the UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which requires, quote, Iran shall not undertake any activity related to ballistic missiles. Fast forward to the JCPOA, if anybody knows this, nod along with me, which reads, Iran is called upon not to undertake any activity regarding ballistic missiles. I'm not that good a lawyer, but I know the difference between shall not and called upon not to. And so we either intentionally sent really bad lawyers to negotiate a deal that puts Iran on a glide path not only to destroy sanctity and peace and stability in the region, we either intentionally did that or we hired the worst possible negotiators who don't know the difference between may and shall, which you learn as a first-year law student. No enmity intended towards anyone in this room, and particularly not the lady and gentleman on the committee. I had to look, Dr. Carlin, to make sure. Would you not agree that the root of the problem with Hezbollah is Iran, and that the root of the problem in Iran is the IRGC, and that the root of the IRGC is Quds, if I want to walk this dog farther down the trail? I mean, if we really want to attack the source of this, do we not look to the IRGC and returning peace and stability and functionality to Iran, whose people want it, but whose people can't have it when the Quds forces are willing to shoot student protesters in the head, right, with impunity, and the United States does nothing? I apologize. I pride myself not on doing soliloquies and diatribes in these things, but I'm frustrated because I think we're mistargeting. Any one of you, gentlemen or lady, is the root of the Hezbollah problem not Iran?
Absolutely.
And is the root of the Iran problem?
The IRGC, of course. And I worked to build the plan at CENTCOM where we went after the Iranians from various levels for various things that they did, including the IRGC, which unfortunately much of that was abandoned as we got closer to the JCPOA. Whether you advocate a regime change or not, we don't accept the regime and its activities, and there's no way to divorce the IRGC from the Iranian economy and from the Lebanese state, in effect.
I'm a big fan of peace and stability, and I advocate loud and vociferously on behalf of regime change. I don't think it needs to be done at the point of a gun. But I do think that we created circumstances in the JCPOA, and we've not pursued our allies, particularly in Europe, who do business with the IRGC, and we can do this with open sources, document it, to make them pick who they want to do business with. Yes, sir.
Let me just put some meat on this bone, for example. The Financial Action Task Force gave Iran a year that ends this month, to improve its behaviors on money laundering and terror finance. Among the many things it's supposed to do are some very technical things, some very broad things. One of the things Iran has said it will not do is delete the cutout that it has for anything it describes as a resistance organization, i.e. Hezbollah. And it doesn't appear they're going to change that. That's this month, and we need to make sure that the administration makes its position very, very clear. This is unacceptable for us, because you will probably not get Iran off the FATF blacklist call for special measures right now, but you'll probably get them a little bit of an extension to see if they can do more.
Mr. Chairman, I'm over time. I want to say, in conclusion, we can have a regime change if we will strictly enforce sanctions. We've never been willing to do that. Hopefully this administration will change that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. We go now to, I think, Mr. Ted Yoho. Nope. Oh, Mr. Jerry Connolly's here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, Ted. I thank my friend from Florida. And welcome to the panel. Dr. Carlin, you familiar with the JCPOA?
Yes, sir, I am.
Was it an all-comprehensive agreement that covered all of Iranians' behavior and our concerns?
I did not work on the JCPOA as an Obama administration official. My understanding is that it is primarily focused on the nuclear piece.
Correct. Can you think of a treaty governing an adversary that was all-comprehensive in history?
Not off the top of my head.
Right. So when President Kennedy, for example, negotiated the first nuclear test ban treaty to ban atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons with then Nikita Khrushchev, and it was widely lauded as a peaceful measure. It didn't address other Soviet behavior. Is that not correct?
Indeed. Usually
Right.
one finds the
And when
areas
one
we
looks
can
at the
agree on.
JCPOA in terms of metrics, based on the fact that it was designed to curb and, in fact, reverse aspects of the nuclear development program in Iran, have those metrics been met, or is it widely agreed that Iran has, in fact, cheated and violated the terms of the agreement?
I think it's a complicated picture, and I'm probably not the best person to address
I
it.
don't think it is complicated. By and large, all of the specific metrics with respect to the Iranian nuclear development program have, in fact, been met, which may be why we're trying to—
Could I just make one interjection?
excuse me, sir.
No, please.
And that may be why we want to divert attention sometimes in this hearing to other aspects of the Iranian behavior that indeed are to be decried and, to the best of our ability, sanctioned. I take enormous exception to my colleague from Virginia asserting that maybe this administration will get serious about sanctions when the previous one did not. It was precisely because sanctions were working in the group of five, holding it together, that brought Iran to the table for the first time.
I couldn't agree more, sir.
And we don't get to rewrite history. You don't have to like it, but you don't get to rewrite it. And I think the record needed to be corrected. So maybe Dr. Levit or Dr. Carlin, but I'm intrigued by Hezbollah's expanding role in the Syrian civil war particularly, where they've been exposed. What is your sense, Dr. Levit, of the cost? I mean, they've lost thousands of fighters. They've lost leadership. Has it weakened Hezbollah, or have they been able to use the exposure in Syria to their advantage in terms of strengthening the organization and its capabilities?
And the honest answer to that question is yes.
Yes, it's weakened them?
Yes, it's weakened them, and yes, it has strengthened them both. And I thought Mard addressed this well in her remarks. Hezbollah's lost more people killed and more people wounded in this so far fairly brief conflict than in all the wars with Israel. It's costing Hezbollah a tremendous amount of money. The fighting in Syria is still getting the funds, but not everything in Lebanon that Hezbollah traditionally does. Some of the other social welfare, political things are not. Again, showing the ties between military terrorism activities and political social welfare activities. It's having an impact in terms of their supporters, as well as some people's families are getting more money than other people, depending on how long you fought. The fact that they're now having to put up banners on the streets in Lebanon saying, well, if you don't really want to fight, you can make about a $1,000 donation and get out of it. It's like people were trying to get out of the forced conscription in Russia or Turkey back in the day. And so they are facing those types of problems. They have, however, had the benefit of the Islamic State rising to be such a threat that there's been a circling of the wagons in Lebanon and elsewhere too, but let's focus on Lebanon. And where people say, listen, I don't like Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is effectively defending me against the Islamic State, and so I don't have the luxury of still being angry at them for dragging my country, Lebanon, into the civil war.
Do you believe that the costs are hurting them back in Lebanon, either in terms of credibility, ability to recruit, or for that matter, participate in whatever governance they participate in?
It is hurting them in terms of their ability to run their programs and their ability to recruit. There is dissension within the ranks among their supporters, but they are getting by just fine. And we need, therefore, right now to take the financial measures that will further undermine them. All of your comments on the JCPOA, I understand. Under the JCPOA, we were told these other things were going to continue. It is a fact that some of these were halted a little bit because some people felt they didn't want to shake the deal. I don't mean to make a statement about the deal there. Now we are where we are. Now's the opportunity to get back on the saddle here because we do have an opportunity to further exacerbate those financial tensions for Hezbollah.
Yes, and this is a test of a new administration. Whether its close ties to Russia can be put to our advantage in terms of curbing the behavior of Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in areas we care about, Syria and Iraq. And maybe it's time to now put that question to the new administration. Thank you. My time is up.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Ted Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the panel being here. I read an article about Hezbollah about a month ago and how it said that it's become a force of over 100,000, very well armed, very well trained, one of the top fighting forces in the world. And I'm going to ask the panel who wants to weigh in on this. Was that possible before the JCPOA and the release of the money that Iran got, or did that benefit Hezbollah to become that strong of a force? Dr. Carlin?
Thank you for that question. That number is a little larger than I've heard, but the concept, I think, is absolutely spot on, that Hezbollah has grown. It has grown more capable quantitatively and qualitatively. But we've seen it on this trajectory for a while now. Back in 2010 or so, my former boss, Secretary Gates, noted that Hezbollah had more missiles and rockets than most governments in the world. I'd say the money has been useful, but it is the Syria conflict that has been determinative.
Right, and that's where it was. It was in Syria is where the report I read. Mm-hmm. And they're not affiliated with a nation as far as a nation government. They're kind of a proxy group, correct?
Hezbollah, it does serve in the Lebanese government.
Okay. And then, Mr. Levit, I want to get clarification. Did you say that Iran should be redesignated as a state sponsor of terror?
Iran is designated a state
That's what I thought, and I misheard you then.
It was in response to a question about whether the context of redesignating Iranian entities that may have been taken off lists under the JCPOA, and my argument that it would be in no way a violation of the JCPOA if they were relisted under still existing sanctions authorities like counterterrorism, which need to be very, very clear and show that evidence, that this is not simply just putting an entity back on the list for proliferation purposes.
Okay. And then, Dr. Asher, you had a comment you wanted to talk to Mr. Connolly about, and I'll give you about 30 seconds if you want to add to it.
Mr. Connolly's points about the JCPOA as a former negotiator in the six-party talks with North Korea and also working on Iran nuclear at one stage. But I'm very concerned about outsourcing. The thing we learned with North Korea in 2002 with the Al-Kabar agreement was that countries could outsource. In 2002, there was an agreement between North Korea and Syria to build Al-Kabar, the nuclear reactor for the nuclear weapons program of Syria. That broke ground in October 2003, according to unclassified information you can get on the internet. That's exactly when the NIE, the CIA, or the National Intelligence Council put out, said the Iranians put their weapons program on hold. That idea that they could have outsourced it has always bothered me personally as an official at the time. And then in 2012, the Iranians and the North Koreans signed a science technology agreement that's almost exactly the same as what they signed with Syria, between North Korea and Syria in 2002. And at the signing ceremony was Fedayeen Abbasi Davani, the head of the Iranian nuclear weapons program.
Right.
He just didn't show up very often in meetings. The question is, what is going on? And is it possible that Iran has outsourced? There's no provision in JCPOA over outsourcing, and it does worry me.
All right, and Dr. Carlin, I want to come back to you. Is there continued production of heavy water in Iran, and does that come from nuclear activity?
I am not aware of that, sir.
All right. Yes, I believe the answer is yes. Is the volume beyond what the JCPOA allows for, which, again, we've read the reports, they're producing more than they should be, and then is that production and value in violation of the JCPOA? If they are doing that, would you say that was in violation?
If that were happening, that is beyond my expertise.
Can anybody else answer that? All right, Mr. Maltz, I'm going to go to you because the work you've done I find very interesting, and I don't know if it was you or Dr. Asher talking about the combination of the terrorist groups with the narco-trafficking. And do you see that increasing in the future?
Absolutely. I mean, everyone in government says that terrorists are increasingly turning to crime and criminal networks for funding because the U.S. government and our allied forces have done such a great job at shutting down their funding streams. They need funds to operate. And one of the biggest things that I saw that's really disturbing is the corruption factor. You can't pay off a general in West Africa with a Visa and a MasterCard. You need a suitcase of cash.
Right.
So the cash that's being generated from drug trafficking, the UN estimated, what, about $400 billion? So it's just common sense that they're going to get involved in drug trafficking and other illicit activity to be able to carry out their agenda. So yes, I'm very concerned, and it is evolving as far as I'm concerned.
Do any of you believe that Hezbollah has been involved in the most recent Iranian kidnapping of the U.S. citizens or U.S. legal permanent residents? And if I don't have the time, Mr. Chairman, if they could submit that.
Is that a nod yes or a nod no? Pardon?
I've seen no evidence to that effect.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. We go to Ann Wagner, Missouri. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing. Hezbollah is obviously a constant violent threat to our allies and to us. The joint statement released by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia last month expressed the importance of supporting the Lebanese state in order to disarm Hezbollah. But I, along with many of my colleagues, are concerned that financial support to Lebanon may mean empowering Hezbollah. Dr. Asher and Mr. Maltz, kind of as a follow-on to Congressman Yoho's questioning, it's well known that Syrian women and children are at risk of being trafficked in Lebanon. We also know that Hezbollah generates revenue from drug trafficking and allegedly human trafficking in the Americas. Can you please discuss Hezbollah's involvement in human trafficking in Lebanon, Syria, globally?
I mean, I have one specific case I can't discuss, but I'm aware of one of the top tier targets. We call them super facilitators. We actually had a thing called the Iran-Hezbollah Super Facilitators Initiative targeting key functional financiers for the Hezbollah-Iran network globally. And I'm aware of one very significant case of Syrian children being trafficked all the way into West Africa by this individual. And it was a very painful case for us because the U.S. government was well aware of it and we did nothing. And it still haunts me that these poor children, and they were like young girls and boys, were sent to a heinous country in West Africa, probably to their death, because the guy in charge seemed to like torturing children. So, you know, that is one case, and he was definitely a Hezbollah senior functional official, also tied to the Iranians.
Disturbing, but thank you, Dr. Asher. Dr. Carlin, your testimony on Iran-Hezbollah relations was fascinating. Can Lebanon or other actors help fill a void that with the Lebanese Shia who are dependent on Hezbollah, as you testimony laid out, in terms of political representation and economic opportunities? And could you also maybe flesh out for me the factors preventing these opportunities?
Thank you very much for that question. I'm delighted that that was useful. There are ways to fill this void, particularly if you look at strengthening Lebanon economically. So what we've seen because of the Syria conflict is people who are joining Hezbollah because they don't have job opportunities, and Hezbollah pays, obviously. So to the extent you could look at microloans or other types of assistance, so that when you go into these areas where Hezbollah is strong, you actually see other entities there. What I find most interesting on political representation, ma'am, is that you do hear some alternative voices to Hezbollah, but in particular, over the last few years, there are fewer and fewer people in Lebanon defending Hezbollah, and that quiet is meaningful and notable.
Interesting. Well, and Dr. Carlin, I'll just stay with you for a moment. On Tuesday, we witnessed U.S.-led airstrikes near Al-Tanf and on Iranian-backed militias in Syria. How interconnected are Hezbollah and these militias, and do you believe that economic sanctions on these militias could help stem Hezbollah's financing?
Thank you for that question. I, too, am really concerned about what's happening right now around Al-Tanf. We see U.S. military getting more involved here, and it is very conceivable something could happen with these militias or with Hezbollah. I think the Hezbollah-militia relationship is extremely tight. They are very much looking to one another. I defer to my colleagues regarding the financial piece, but my instinct is if you can help weaken one, that's largely beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I'll just add on 2 points, both of which are in my written testimony. One is absolutely, we need to be targeting not just Hezbollah, but the other Shia militias with which it's partnering very, very closely. And to get to some of the earlier questions, both of them together with Iranian soldiers and operatives on the ground in Syria. Al-Tanf is something we need to look at very, very closely. In the wake of that strike that you mentioned, Hezbollah issued a kind of veiled warning to the U.S. not to cross Hezbollah's red lines in the area.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing regarding Dr. Asher's comment on the super facilitators, I mentioned briefly in my oral remarks the need to target these key networks. In my written testimony, I get into detail that we should be targeting among those the super facilitators, some of whom, I think including the one that Dr. Asher was referring to, are really, they are Hezbollah people. Others are not. Others, they're not Hezbollah operatives. They're criminals. They're super facilitators who will help Hezbollah today and some other criminal enterprise tomorrow. But they play these mission-critical roles, whether it's money laundering or accessing banks, and we should be targeting them as well, even if they're not card-carrying Hezbollah members, because they're providing mission-critical, particular logistic and financial support to Hezbollah.
I thank you all, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I'm out of time, and I'll yield back.
We are out of time, but thank you very much, Ambassador Wagner. We appreciate the time, the service, and the expertise of our witnesses here this morning. And as we've heard, there's much work to be done to rebuild our law enforcement capabilities to tackle Hezbollah. And we look forward to working with our witnesses as we press the administration to do just that. Thank you very much. We stand adjourned.
Thank you very much.